Hello, everybody. I'm here with Cas Mudde, a friend and also a political scientist at UGA. He is with us today to speak about soccer and civil society. He is originally from the Netherlands, an avid ground hooper, for those that are not aware, a supporter of PSV, Clava, and Portland Timbers, and today wearing the jersey of the Bohemians from Dublin. Very political jersey, which is more than necessary nowadays. So we're very glad to host Cas Mudde, who has been writing a lot about the far right and populism. And he's now going to a different way of research, mixing with football. And that's what we're going to be discussing today. So, Cas, thanks for being with us. And it's a big pleasure to have you here.
It's a big pleasure to be here.
Great. Cas, people know you about your research on populism, which is not normally linked with football in your studies, but now you are kind of bringing your passion, right, to research. So can you introduce yourself and your research as well in general terms?
Yeah, so I'm originally from the Netherlands and I'm a political scientist. I have worked mostly on political parties, so pretty mainstream political science stuff, but I focused on far-right parties in Europe. And over the years, I've done a lot on populism, on the far right, on the challenge to liberal democracy. And to a certain extent, that's where the overlap with soccer and politics came. Like I've always been a huge soccer fan, and I've been ground topping everywhere, and I've always been interested in kind of the culture of soccer more than the tactics or something like that. And I kind of wanted to work on this earlier, but I thought you can't do that. You can't get a job. So now that I have a steady job, like I started to think, okay, so these challenges to liberal democracy, I also see them in soccer. And so I want to work on that.
Mm-hmm. That's fascinating. So can you start telling us about this new idea of writing about football or soccer, as we were saying here, and civil society, and what are the correlations between these two topics?
Yeah, so sorry, I will talk about soccer for a variety of reasons, but also alliterates better with soccer as civil society. Um, so I used to work on civil society in the 1990s when it was a key concept in thinking about democracy and democratization in Eastern Europe. And very simply stated, civil society is the space between the state and kind of the family. And so it's a huge social space in which there's a lot happening, including a lot of politics, both kind of like very highly identifiable politics, party politics, but also just the everyday type of politics, opposing whatever the closing of a local playground, whatever. And so the idea of civil society and soccer became kind of implicitly very important in the Arab Spring and in the Gezi protest. And so there what we saw were ultras who were kind of defending democracy, or at the very least challenging authoritarianism. And while a lot of was written about it, very little was written in the context of civil society. And I think that's in part because there's still very few political scientists writing about soccer and politics. It's mostly sociologists, historians, and people from the humanities. And so I thought a lot of that literature is very naive. They kind of look at ultras as these kind of pro-democracy forces that civil society is always pro-democracy. But the literature on civil society shows that civil society is kind of politically neutral. You have pro-democracy forces, anti-democracy forces, and civil society can be good for democracy or bad for democracy. And I think ultras are a very good example of that. They played a very positive role in the Gezi protest in Istanbul. challenging the authoritarian regime of Erdogan. But they, for example, are also involved in threatening and beating up pride marches in Belgrade, in Serbia. And so I wanted to kind of bring that civil society literature in. And at the same time, I also wanted to link it to the concept of modern football.
Perfect. So talking about modern football, it's a concept that we have been discussing in literature for a long time, and it has been even more present nowadays because of these new conglomerates of football clubs merging, and as you point out in your chapter that is coming soon, those farm type of clubs, right, in which they kind of exchange players within their network, and it makes them more. It gives them more profits, and of course, gives them more options to select players to bring to their teams and make them more successful, right? Modern football also has been discussed in terms of gentrification, in terms of raising ticket prices. There are many, many facets of why modern football for many fans is a problem. So, in this context, how modern football threatens civil society?
Yeah, so my idea is that soccer is part of civil society, and actually a much bigger part than we often give credit to. A lot of the literature on civil society is on, for example, human rights organizations or Greenpeace or things like that. But actually, these organizations involve very few people, whereas soccer clubs traditionally, even more professional ones in Europe and Latin America, not in North America, like have some involvement of people. The clubs themselves were often rooted in the community and were therefore part of the political system. The fans were, and so I believe that modern football, as the kind of highly marketized, commodified, globalized form of football that we see today, threatens civil society and therefore democracy within the space of soccer in two ways. On the one hand, you have an illiberal threat coming from authoritarian regimes that increasingly spend money. And the other one is neoliberalism. So, I mean, very simple, these terms, like they on the one end are the anti-democrats, and the other one is the capitalists, like the money. And of course, they work together because the authoritarian regimes profit from the neoliberalization of international soccer. Money is more important. Gulf states have that money and buy access. But as we have, for example, seen at the Qatar World Cup, that comes at a big price. So now we can't, for example, wear a One Love band, right? You can't say certain things because the regime doesn't want that. I think the key threat of neoliberalism to soccer is that it sanitizes soccer. And so one of the things is gentrification. But what you see with particularly the larger clubs, as well as the larger leagues, and the Premier League is a very good example of that, they act very much like global brands act. And what are brands concerned about? About the brand reputation. And when your brand is very large and has a diffuse like customer base, because that's how they see it, like Real Madrid or Man United, then you start to be very bland on anything that could be potentially controversial, because that's bad for business, right? And so what you see, I mean, the Premier League has, like, for the money, for the players, for the history of English football, the Premier League is pretty dead inside. Like, the stadiums do not have the type of atmosphere, which is partly because of gentrification, but it's also you can't take anything in the stadium. Right? Everything is controlled, the whole environment, and so that in and by itself is a big problem. The other thing is that you see it even in the players, right? Players are now commodities, they're brands, and So you used to have interesting players like Paul Breitner, who was like the midfielder for Bayern Munich in the 70s, 80s, who was supposed to be a Marxist, right? Even though he wrote for a right-wing tabloid, Bild. Günther Netzer was like a rebel. Cruyff would make all kind of statements. And now you have Messi, you have Ronaldo, you have Neymar, right?
Yeah.
Which are just brands. They're bland. Nothing comes out of them because that's how soccer conditions.
Mhm.
Now, you see a very big difference with women's soccer, right? Women's soccer is much less commodified. And also, women's soccer is almost by definition a transgression to the trend because soccer is traditionally seen as masculine. And so when a woman plays soccer, she kind of transgresses gender roles.
Mhm.
And we see in women's soccer very outspoken players, like not just Rapinoe, but others have spoken out as well. Um, I think that is in part because it hasn't been commodified yet. So the commodification is I think a problem.
Mhm.
Interestingly, though, commodification does not mean that there is no politics, right? There is politics that is uncontroversial, which is, for example, pinkwashing campaigns in favor of LGBTQI rights,
Mhm.
right? Which is very interesting. You have the MLS that claims that we should keep soccer and politics separated, and yet you see like rainbow flags everywhere,
Yeah.
but in such a way that it doesn't upset anyone, right? So that the message is out. The same with anti-racism campaigns. They are just floating above it. No one says exactly who the racists are because that would be controversial. So that's part of the sanitation. The sanitation of soccer doesn't mean there's no politics at all,
Mhm.
but that there is a kind of a pinkwashing type of politics.
That's a really really interesting point because it's what we see in every weekend, right? Like every weekend we see the same type of kind of political messages that are fully controlled. Um, and when we mix Saudi, these capitalists coming and managing those new, well, traditional clubs, historically traditional clubs like Newcastle United now, or Manchester City, and then we see a decrease in those political messages. But talking about these ways that football fans deals with modern football, we recently saw in Germany a call to unite pro-democracy, right? The elections just happened in Germany, and not just football fan bases, but the clubs in themselves have gathered to avoid the rise of the AfD. In your chapter, you categorize two ways that football fans, and we can to some extent a few clubs resist and innovate against modern football, as well as neoliberal forces. Can you tell us which are those two ways to deal with this modern threat in football?
Yeah, so on the one hand, you see resistance, which is purely pushing back, right? And on the other hand, you see innovations, which means that you try to create a different type of football. Now, uh, the example of Germany, like, is not by chance. Like Germany is by far the most politicized soccer country. To be clear, many of these ultra groups are small and don't represent the whole body of fans, not even at a highly politicized club like St. Pauli, but certainly not at Bayern or at Werder Bremen. But there is virtually not a game in Germany where you don't see some type of political banner, right? And so in terms of resistance, what we see is banners more than songs, but you see songs sometimes in North Africa, for example, that are pushing back more to illiberalism than to neoliberalism. We have seen boycotts, and actually we've seen boycotts in various countries. There's kind of atmosphere boycotts. So, for example, the fans will either not come into the stadium until the 30th minute or something, or they won't sing in the first half. And there are two elements to it. There's one, the message of like, often it's about higher ticket prices, or in Germany, they had introduced games on Monday. And actually the protests were so successful that they then ran that back, right? But the other message is, we are soccer. Like, without us, you have nothing to commodify. And I think one of the things that we saw very strongly at COVID, right, is that they were really struggling to sell the product by creating fake audiences and sounds. But in the end, like, yes, we look at the game, but if there's no atmosphere, like, it's not that attractive. At the same time, like, as I said, this commodification is also very much about what is being presented, right? And so there's a pushback against pyro, for example, because that looks aggressive and that is not good for marketing. Now, another resistance is resistance to the takeover of clubs by often multi-club ownerships or other types of very large conglomerates, increasingly American, who are there. And so these are often kind of David versus Goliath stories. And my favorite story is from my own country, the Netherlands, a club called NAC from Breda, which is a very, very traditional club rooted in that town. And the city group wanted to take them over.
Mhm.
And that led to a massive backlash, including fans going to Manchester to protest. So Manchester City fans actually helped them put some banners close to the stadium. And in the end, they were able to prevent the takeover. That being said, it's now being owned by a conglomerate of local businessmen. So you don't necessarily take money out, but at least you're not just a pawn in one of these big schemes, right? And then, of course, there's opposition to the restructuring of soccer, and that's the story of the European Super League. I think, again, overplayed. The European Super League was a non-starter from the beginning. There were, for example, the German teams never said that they wanted to be part of it. It was Barcelona, Real who wanted it very much, and there were some owners of English teams. But there was a pushback. European Super League was gone for the moment. It's back now. Um, I think what's interesting there is that you see this power, whereas at the same time, the European Super League is really not that much different from the Champions League. The Champions League is also purely to protect the rich teams and to make sure that they go as far as possible so that you make as much money as possible. Now, very interesting are the innovations. So on the one hand, you have innovations in clubs where fans push back and demand influence. And that can go in different ways. It generally is not very successful. But at the very least, what it often does is that you get kind of what they used to call capitalism with a human face. So that now the big owners, right, will say, okay, well, we won't change the club colors. Like, we will respect one part of the stadium that is affordable. What has gotten a lot of attention are new fan-owned clubs. Um, and so the most famous is the FC United of Manchester, but there are actually dozens of clubs around the world. And the interesting thing there is that they really create something next to modern football. Now, fan-owned clubs have existed for a long time, and like Bohemian Dublin, Ireland, is a fan-owned club and plays at the highest level. Most of the new fan-owned clubs don't even aspire so much to play at the top. What they want is to bring soccer back into the community. And so it's highly political. The problem is when they start to become more successful, they often want to play higher again. And then they reach out to a donor, and the donor says, well, I want to have more than just one vote. And often then you have the choice. Either you remain a marginal team or you become more successful, but also more and more like modern football.
Yeah, it seems that as soon as team starts to win and getting more successful, they're more dependent on new resources, and that means being subsumed for capitalism, and sometimes, as you mentioned, on new authoritarian regimes that are gonna have an interest to buy or have a majority stake in your club. Cas, you here in this new type of format for our football studies episodes, I'm asking a last question, a surprise questions to all our guests, which is just can you resume in a simple phrase? It can be complex as well, but what is football for you based on everything you have experienced? For instance, for me, it's really a thing of how football is complex, how, for instance, we cannot put football clubs into little boxes in terms of like political orientations throughout their histories. Let's say we nowadays many people say Real Madrid is a fascist club, but no one knows that they had a communist president in the Civil War. So what is for you football, and how can you summarize what it represents to your type of research as well?
Community. I think for me, football is community, is culture. And like I've had discussions with Simon Cooper, the journalist, about this, who thinks that I'm just a naive nostalgic who wants his football from his youth back. And to a certain extent, that is it. Like, I mean, I support the team PSV Eindhoven, which obviously they were founded by Philips, like a huge company. So money has always been there, but at the same time, this was the old industrial part where Philips was the main employer, like an industry of the city of Eindhoven. Philips was committed to that city. Many of the workers, right, were season holders. They had that connection, and so for me, soccer is community. That's why I ground hop, right? And so I remember going to the SSV Ulm in Germany when they were in the 6th division, I think. And there were 7,000 people, right? And they all come walking, like, or biking to the stadium, right? Because the stadium is part of that community. It's not some kind of monstrous arena of a motorway. That all these things, like the way that stadiums are built, where they are built, they break up that community. And so for me, yeah, football is community.
That's fascinating. Cause I'm sure you'll have a lot more to discuss. Unfortunately, this new format, we're trying to make things short, but maybe that's an opportunity for a second episode, and then we can continue these conversations. Again, Cas, appreciate your time, and I'm sure the audience will have a blast hearing your thoughts.
Thank you.
Thank you.